On the morning of October 8, 1942, at 0615 hours, Sergeant John Basilone crouched in the muddy foxholes of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, gripping a weapon that would rewrite the rules of jungle warfare. The 19-pound Browning automatic rifle hummed in his hands as the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs echoed through the dense Solomon Islands jungle. Somewhere in the green maze ahead, Japanese soldiers from Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura's 17th Army waited in their carefully prepared defensive positions, armed with bolt-action Arisaka rifles, and the confidence that came from decades of military tradition. For months, the Imperial Japanese Army had dominated Pacific battlefields through disciplined, static defense tactics, digging in, holding ground, and forcing enemies to come to them. Their soldiers had been trained to believe that patience, precision, and fixed positions would always defeat reckless American aggression. When they heard Marines approaching through the jungle, they expected the familiar crack of single-shot rifles, the predictable rhythm of bolt-action warfare they had mastered since the Russo-Japanese War. But that morning, as Private Samuel Jackson moved through the undergrowth 30 yards behind Basilone, something was different. The young Marine carried his bar with the fluid confidence of a predator, not the cautious stance of a defender. The weapon's 20-round magazine gleamed in the filtered sunlight, and its ability to fire 650 rounds per minute meant that one Marine could deliver the firepower of an entire squad. Japanese Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara, hidden behind a fallen log 200 yards away, had never seen anything like what was about to happen. His training told him that machine guns were heavy, stationary weapons that required tripods and teams of men. The idea that a single American soldier could walk through the jungle while carrying the equivalent of a light machine gun was impossible, until it wasn't. When Basilone opened fire, the jungle erupted with a sound that Japanese soldiers would later describe in captured diaries as the walking thunder. But this wasn't just about firepower. It was about something far more terrifying that would shatter everything the Imperial Army thought they knew about warfare. The morning mist clung to the jungle floor of Guadalcanal like smoke from a dying fire, and in the half-light of dawn on October 8, 1942, the Solomon Islands seemed to hold their breath. Sergeant John Basilone adjusted his grip on the Browning automatic rifle, feeling the familiar weight of 19 pounds of steel and wood that had become an extension of his body over the past 3 weeks of fighting. Behind him, 8 Marines from the 7th Regiment's machine gun section moved through the dense undergrowth with the careful precision of men who had learned that survival depended on silence until the moment it depended on overwhelming violence. The bar in Basilone's hands was not the weapon the U.S. Marine Corps had originally intended to carry into the Pacific. Designed by John Moses Browning during World War I for walking fire tactics on the Western Front, the rifle had been built to allow infantry to advance while maintaining continuous automatic fire against German trenches. But the Marines had discovered something Browning himself had never anticipated in the dense jungles of the Pacific: mobility and firepower combined into something that transcended the sum of its parts. The weapon's 650 round per minute cyclic rate, fed by 20-round magazines loaded with 30-06 cartridges, could cut through bamboo thickets and human targets with equal efficiency. Private Samuel Jackson, moving 15 yards to Basilone's left, carried his own bar with the confidence that came from 3 months of intensive training at Camp Lejeune and 2 weeks of actual combat experience. At 19 years old, Jackson had learned to appreciate the weapon's brutal simplicity, a gas-operated system that cycled automatically as long as he held the trigger, with a bipod that could be deployed for sustained fire or folded back for rapid movement. The Marine Corps had issued 1 bar to each 12-man rifle squad, but Jackson's unit had acquired additional weapons through battlefield salvage and creative requisitioning that would have made their supply sergeants weep. The jungle around them pulsed with the sounds of a living ecosystem that had been turned into a killing ground. Fruit bats hung motionless in the canopy above, while insects buzzed in clouds that seemed to follow the Marines like miniature reconnaissance aircraft. The air carried the smell of rotting vegetation, cordite from yesterday's artillery barrage, and something else: the acrid scent of fear that every combat veteran learned to recognize. Somewhere ahead, hidden in defensive positions that had been prepared over weeks of careful construction, Japanese soldiers from Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura's 17th Army waited with the patience that military doctrine had taught them was their greatest advantage. Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree that provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire across the narrow valley his platoon had been ordered to defend. His Type 99 Arisaka rifle lay across the log, its bolt-action mechanism clean and ready. The 5-round internal magazine loaded with 7.7mm cartridges that could drop an American at 400 meters if properly aimed. Ogasawara had been fighting since the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, and he understood that warfare was fundamentally about patience, discipline, and the careful application of marksmanship at the right moment. The Japanese defensive doctrine that had served the Imperial Army across China and Southeast Asia was built on simple principles that had proven effective against British, Dutch, and Chinese forces. Establish strong defensive positions, force the enemy to attack across open ground, and use superior marksmanship to inflict casualties until the attackers lost their will to continue. Ogasawara's men were armed with weapons that reflected this philosophy. Bolt-action rifles that rewarded careful aim, light machine guns like the Type 96 that required crews and fixed positions, and grenade dischargers that could provide indirect fire support from concealed locations. But as the morning progressed and the sounds of American movement grew closer, Ogasawara began to notice something that contradicted everything his training had taught him about how infantry warfare functioned. The approaching Marines were not advancing in the careful, methodical fashion that doctrine dictated. Instead, they seemed to be moving through the jungle with a fluid confidence that suggested they were not afraid of making contact with the enemy. The sound of their movement carried a rhythm that was unfamiliar, not the stop-and-go pattern of soldiers who expected to take cover and return fire, but something that sounded almost like a continuous advance. Jackson paused at the base of a coconut palm and listened to the jungle sounds around him, sorting through the natural noise for anything that might indicate enemy positions. His bar was loaded with a fresh 20-round magazine, and he carried 12 additional magazines in canvas pouches that had been modified to allow for faster reloading. The weapons selector switch was set to automatic, because Jackson had learned that in jungle fighting, the ability to deliver immediate, overwhelming firepower usually mattered more than ammunition conservation. The tactical revolution that the bar represented was not immediately obvious to military theorists or weapons designers, but it was becoming crystal clear to the Marines who carried the weapon into combat. Traditional military thinking assumed that automatic weapons required teams, tripods, and fixed positions to be effective. A machine gun was supposed to be a defensive tool that could control terrain through sustained fire, not a portable weapon that allowed individual soldiers to advance while shooting. But the Marines had discovered that in the close-range, chaotic environment of jungle warfare, a single man with an automatic rifle could accomplish what an entire squad with bolt-action weapons could not. Basilone raised his hand to signal a halt, and the Marines behind him froze in place, like statues carved from jungle shadow. Through the undergrowth ahead, he could see the outline of prepared defensive positions, carefully constructed firing pits connected by communication trenches, with overhead cover made from logs and coral rock. The Japanese had done everything right according to conventional military wisdom, creating a defensive line that would channel attack into predetermined killing zones where disciplined rifle fire could devastate an advancing force. What the Japanese defenders could not have anticipated was that conventional military wisdom was about to collide with a weapon system that made conventional tactics obsolete. The bar in Basilone's hands contained the power to rewrite the fundamental assumptions about how infantry combat functioned, and in the next few minutes, those assumptions would be tested against the reality of automatic fire delivered by Marines who had learned to use mobility as a weapon. The weapon that would terrorize Japanese soldiers across the Pacific had been born from the mind of a Utah Mormon who understood that the fundamental problem of infantry warfare was the gap between firepower and mobility. John Moses Browning had spent decades perfecting automatic weapon systems, but when the U.S. Army approached him in 1917 with specifications for a portable automatic rifle, he faced a challenge that would require him to abandon conventional thinking about how such weapons should function. The Army wanted something that weighed less than 20 pounds, could fire the standard .30-06 cartridge, and would allow infantry to advance while maintaining continuous automatic fire against German trenches. Browning's solution was elegant in its complexity. The Browning automatic rifle used a gas-operated system that captured propellant gases from each fired cartridge and used that energy to cycle the action, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. The weapon's barrel was 24 inches long, providing the velocity needed for the powerful .30-06 cartridge, while keeping the overall length manageable for a soldier moving through trenches or undergrowth. A bipod could be deployed for sustained fire positions, or folded back against the barrel when the weapon needed to be carried at the ready. But the bar's most revolutionary feature was not its mechanical design, it was the tactical philosophy that the weapon embodied. Traditional automatic weapons like the water-cooled Maxim gun or the air-cooled Hotchkiss were designed to be fired from fixed positions, with crews of multiple men to handle ammunition, cooling, and maintenance. These weapons were defensive tools that controlled terrain through sustained fire, requiring careful planning and logistical support to be effective. The bar, by contrast, was designed to move with the infantry, providing automatic fire support wherever the attack required it. When the weapon first appeared on European battlefields in September 1918, German soldiers reported encounters with American troops who seemed to advance through machine gun fire without taking cover. The walking fire tactics that the bar enabled allowed entire squads to maintain forward momentum while delivering automatic fire against defensive positions, creating a psychological effect that was as devastating as the physical damage. German defensive doctrine, built around the assumption that attacking infantry would be forced to seek cover and return single shots, simply could not cope with attackers who advanced while shooting automatically. The war ended before the bar could demonstrate its full potential, and during the interwar years, military theorists struggled to understand exactly what role the weapon should play in future conflicts. The U.S. Army classified it as an automatic rifle rather than a light machine gun, reflecting confusion about whether it was a precision weapon or a fire support tool. Infantry manuals from the 1920s and 30s described contradictory employment methods, sometimes treating the bar as a long-range marksman's weapon and other times as a close-range assault tool. The U.S. Marine Corps, however, approached the weapon with the pragmatic flexibility that would become their trademark in the Pacific War. Marine training emphasized small unit tactics and fire and movement drills that took advantage of the bar's unique capabilities. Rather than trying to fit the weapon into existing tactical categories, Marine instructors taught their men to think of the bar as a force multiplier that could provide automatic fire support wherever the tactical situation required it. Each 12-man rifle squad received one bar, but Marines quickly learned to concentrate multiple automatic rifles at critical points during an assault. By 1942, when the Marine Corps shipped out for the Solomon Islands, the typical Marine division carried 513 bars distributed among infantry units. Each weapon was supported by a basic load of 600 rounds per rifle, with additional ammunition carried by squad members, who had been trained to serve as assistant automatic riflemen. The Marines had also modified their load-carrying equipment to accommodate the weapon's unique requirements, developing chest rigs and magazine pouches that allowed bar men to carry 20 or more loaded magazines into combat. The Japanese military, meanwhile, had developed automatic weapons doctrine around entirely different principles. The Type 96 light machine gun, which equipped Japanese infantry squads, was designed as a crew-served weapon that fired from a bipod or tripod mount. Weighing 23 pounds and firing a smaller 6.5mm cartridge, the Type 96 was optimized for sustained defensive fire rather than mobile operations. Japanese tactical manuals emphasized the importance of establishing machine gun positions that could control key terrain features, with the weapons carefully sighted to provide interlocking fields of fire. This doctrinal difference reflected deeper philosophical disagreements about how infantry warfare should be conducted. Japanese military thinking, heavily influenced by their experiences in China and Manchuria, emphasized the importance of prepared defensive positions and disciplined marksmanship. Japanese soldiers were trained to dig elaborate defensive systems and to rely on superior shooting skills to defeat numerically superior enemies. The concept of advancing while firing automatically was foreign to Japanese doctrine, which viewed automatic weapons as defensive tools that required careful positioning to be effective. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, had organized his defenses according to these established principles. His troops had constructed elaborate bunker systems connected by communication trenches, with machine gun positions carefully sighted to provide overlapping fields of fire. Each defensive position was designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where disciplined rifle fire could inflict maximum casualties. The Japanese expected American attacks to follow predictable patterns, infantry advancing in lines or columns, seeking cover when fired upon, and attempting to close with defensive positions through careful maneuvering. What Imamura and his subordinates could not have anticipated was that American infantry tactics had evolved to take advantage of weapon systems that made traditional defensive thinking obsolete. The Marines approaching Japanese positions on Guadalcanal were not planning to seek cover and return aimed fire. They were planning to advance continuously while delivering automatic fire that would suppress defensive positions and allow the attack to maintain momentum. The bar was not just a weapon in their tactical system. It was the foundation of an entirely new approach to infantry combat that would render Japanese defensive doctrine ineffective. Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara, waiting in his carefully prepared defensive position, represented the pinnacle of Japanese military training and experience. His marksmanship skills had been honed through years of combat in China, and his understanding of defensive tactics reflected decades of military tradition that stretched back to the Russo-Japanese War. But in the next few minutes, Ogasawara would discover that all of his training and experience had prepared him to fight an enemy that no longer existed. The training that separated Marine Corps infantry from other military forces began at Paris Island and Camp Lejeune, where drill instructors hammered home a fundamental principle that would prove decisive in Pacific combat. Adaptability under fire was more valuable than rigid adherence to doctrine. While other military services trained their soldiers to follow prescribed procedures for specific tactical situations, Marine instructors taught their men to think dynamically about combat problems and to use whatever tools were available to achieve tactical objectives. This philosophical difference became crucial when Marines encountered weapons like the bar that did not fit neatly into existing tactical categories. Marine training emphasized what instructors called fire and movement drills that required squads to advance continuously while maintaining suppressive fire against enemy positions. These exercises were conducted with live ammunition over terrain that simulated Pacific Island conditions, forcing Marines to learn how to coordinate automatic fire with squad movement in real time. Each drill began with the squad spread out in a skirmish line, advancing toward a simulated enemy position while one or more bar men provided covering fire. The key was timing. Automatic riflemen had to deliver sustained bursts at precisely the right moments to keep enemy heads down, while riflemen moved forward to new positions. Private Samuel Jackson had spent hundreds of hours mastering these techniques during his training at Camp Lejeune, learning to fire accurate bursts while moving through obstacles that resembled Pacific jungle terrain. The bar's weight and length made it challenging to maneuver in dense vegetation, but Jackson had developed techniques for carrying the weapon at different angles depending on the tactical situation. In thick jungle, he held the rifle across his body at chest level, ready to bring it to his shoulder instantly when targets appeared. In more open terrain, he carried it at the ready position, with the bipod folded back and his finger near the trigger guard. The critical skill that separated effective barmen from those who simply sprayed ammunition was learning to control burst length through trigger discipline. The weapon's cyclic rate of 650 rounds per minute meant that a 3-second burst would fire approximately 32 rounds, emptying more than half of a 20-round magazine. Jackson had trained until he could deliver precise 2 to 5 round bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect, adjusting his technique based on range and target type. Against area targets like bunkers or foxholes, he used longer bursts to keep enemies under cover. Against individual targets, he fired short bursts that concentrated rounds in a small area. Japanese training, by contrast, emphasized individual marksmanship and disciplined fire control that reflected a fundamentally different philosophy about how infantry combat should be conducted. Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara had learned his craft during the Second Sino-Japanese War, where Japanese forces had consistently defeated numerically superior Chinese armies through superior shooting skills and tactical discipline. Japanese soldiers were trained to fire single, well-aimed shots at ranges up to 400 meters, conserving ammunition while inflicting precise casualties on attacking forces. The Japanese approach to automatic weapons reflected this emphasis on precision and fire discipline. Type 96 light machine gun crews were trained to establish firing positions that maximized the weapon's effective range while minimizing ammunition expenditure. Each machine gun team included a gunner, an assistant, gunner who handled ammunition and barrel changes, and often a third man who served as an ammunition bearer and provided local security. These crews practiced establishing positions, camouflaging their weapons, and delivering precise bursts at predetermined target areas. Japanese defensive doctrine assumed that attacking forces would behave predictably when subjected to accurate defensive fire. Military manuals taught that infantry would seek cover when fired upon, allowing defenders to concentrate fire on exposed individuals and break up attack formations. The concept of attackers who advanced continuously while firing automatically was outside the scope of Japanese tactical thinking, because such tactics seemed to violate basic principles of fire discipline and ammunition conservation. This doctrinal difference became apparent when Marine units began their assault on Japanese positions around Henderson Field. Ogasawara's platoon had prepared their defensive line according to established principles, with interlocking fields of fire that would channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. Each rifleman had been assigned specific sectors of responsibility, with range cards that indicated precise distances to key terrain features. The machine gun position was sighted to provide enfilade fire across the most likely avenue of approach, with alternate positions prepared in case the primary position was compromised. When the Marines began their advance, Ogasawara initially expected to see familiar tactical patterns: infantry moving in short rushes from cover to cover, with individual soldiers exposing themselves briefly before seeking protection behind trees or rocks. This was how Chinese forces had attacked during the Shanghai fighting in 1937, and it was how British forces had behaved during the early stages of the Malayan campaign. Such tactics allowed disciplined defenders to engage individual targets with well-aimed shots, gradually wearing down the attacking force until it lost momentum and withdrew. But as the sound of American movement grew closer, Ogasawara began to detect something that contradicted his expectations. The approaching Marines were not moving in the stop-and-go pattern that defensive fire was designed to disrupt. Instead, they seemed to be advancing steadily through the undergrowth, with a rhythm that suggested they were not planning to seek cover when fired upon. The sound carried a mechanical quality that was unfamiliar, not the irregular noise of soldiers moving cautiously, but something that resembled the steady operation of machinery. Jackson moved through the jungle with the fluid confidence that came from months of realistic training combined with combat experience gained during the initial landings on Guadalcanal. His bar was loaded and ready, with the selector switch set to automatic and a 20-round magazine seated firmly in the weapon. He carried additional magazines in pouches that had been positioned for maximum accessibility, allowing him to reload without taking his eyes off potential targets. The bipod was folded back against the barrel, and the weapon's balance point had become as familiar to him as the weight of his own arms. The Marines advancing with Jackson had been trained to coordinate their movement with automatic fire in ways that Japanese defenders had never encountered. Each squad member understood his role in the fire and movement system, with riflemen ready to advance when the barman delivered suppressive fire, and the barman prepared to move forward when riflemen provided covering fire with their semi-automatic Garans. This coordination had been practiced until it became instinctive, allowing the squad to maintain continuous forward momentum regardless of enemy resistance. As the distance between the two forces closed to less than 100 yards, both sides prepared for contact with expectations shaped by entirely different concepts of how infantry combat should unfold. The Japanese expected to engage individual targets with precise rifle fire, gradually degrading the attack until it collapsed. The Marines expected to overwhelm defensive positions with automatic fire while advancing continuously, never allowing defenders time to recover from suppression. These conflicting approaches were about to collide in a confrontation that would demonstrate the revolutionary impact of portable automatic weapons on infantry warfare. The first burst from Basilone's bar shattered the morning silence, with a sound that Japanese soldiers would later describe in captured diaries as ripping canvas, but amplified until it seemed to fill the entire jungle. 20 rounds of .30-06 ammunition left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second, cutting through bamboo stalks and palm fronds with the efficiency of a mechanical harvester. Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara, crouched behind his mahogany log barricade, felt wood chips explode around his position as bullets that missed human targets continued to chew through the defensive position itself. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Ogasawara had experienced machine gun fire during the fighting in China, but those weapons had been fired from fixed positions by crews who established their guns and then defended specific terrain features. The sound approaching his position was different. It moved through the jungle like a living thing, advancing steadily while maintaining continuous automatic fire. The Japanese sergeant raised his Arisaka rifle and attempted to acquire a target, but the muzzle flashes he could see through the undergrowth seemed to shift position constantly, making accurate return fire nearly impossible. Jackson opened fire 3 seconds after Basilone, his bar adding its voice to the mechanical thunder that was transforming the jungle into a killing ground. His first burst was aimed at a suspected machine gun position 30 yards to his left front, where movement in the vegetation suggested enemy activity. The bullets impacted with wet slapping sounds as they tore through banana leaves and struck the coral rock behind Japanese positions. Unlike the careful, aimed shots that defensive doctrine assumed attackers would fire, Jackson's automatic bursts were designed to suppress rather than kill, keeping enemy soldiers under cover while the Marine assault maintained forward momentum. The Japanese Type 96 light machine gun crew that had been positioned to provide enfilade fire across the Marines' expected avenue of approach found themselves facing a tactical situation for which their training had not prepared them. The machine gunner, Private Takeshi Yamamoto, had spent 4 years learning to fire disciplined bursts at specific targets, conserving ammunition while inflicting precise casualties on attacking forces. But the Americans approaching his position were not behaving like attackers. They were firing continuously while advancing, creating a volume of suppressive fire that made it impossible for him to raise his head long enough to aim his weapon effectively. The sound signature of the advancing Marines created a form of psychological warfare that Japanese defenders had never encountered. Each bar firing at 650 rounds per minute produced a distinctive mechanical rhythm that was both hypnotic and terrifying. When multiple bars fired simultaneously, the overlapping cycles created a sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Japanese soldiers, trained to locate enemy positions by muzzle flashes and individual rifle reports, found themselves disoriented by automatic fire that seemed to emerge from the jungle itself. Ogasawara attempted to coordinate defensive fire from his platoon, shouting orders that were barely audible over the sound of incoming automatic fire. His riflemen, armed with bolt-action Arisakas that required manual operation between shots, found themselves at a devastating disadvantage against enemies who could maintain continuous fire while advancing. Each time a Japanese soldier exposed himself long enough to chamber a fresh round and acquire a target, automatic fire would rake his position, forcing him back under cover before he could deliver aimed shots. The tactical revolution that the Bayar represented became apparent as the Marine assault gained momentum. Traditional defensive positions designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones where disciplined rifle fire could inflict maximum casualties became death traps for the defenders when attackers could advance while delivering automatic fire. Japanese foxholes and bunkers, carefully sited to provide overlapping fields of fire, instead became isolated positions that could be suppressed individually while Marines maneuvered to flanking positions. Basilone paused behind a coconut palm to reload, ejecting the empty 20-round magazine and inserting a fresh one with the practiced efficiency that had made him legendary among Marine automatic riflemen. The weapon's gas-operated action cycled smoothly as he resumed firing, sending bursts towards suspected enemy positions while maintaining his advance through the undergrowth. His technique combined the walking fire tactics that John Browning had envisioned with innovations developed through combat experience, short, controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining suppressive effect. The Marine Corps' decision to increase bar allocation from 513 per division in 1943 to 867 by 1945 reflected hard-earned lessons about the weapon's tactical impact. Each additional automatic rifle exponentially increased a unit's ability to maintain suppressive fire while maneuvering, creating a force multiplication effect that traditional military calculations had not anticipated. The Japanese defenders facing Basilone's assault were experiencing this multiplication in real time, as a single Marine squad delivered firepower equivalent to a reinforced platoon armed with conventional rifles. Jackson advanced through a grove of coconut palms, his bar ready as he scanned for targets through the smoke and debris created by automatic fire. The jungle floor was littered with spent brass casings, chopped vegetation, and the distinctive smell of cordite mixed with tropical decay. His training had prepared him for this environment, teaching him to use automatic fire to create psychological pressure as well as physical destruction. Each burst was calculated to maintain the advance while preventing enemy soldiers from recovering their composure long enough to organize effective resistance. The Japanese machine gun position finally managed to return fire, but the Type 96's mechanical characteristics made it poorly suited for the mobile engagement that was developing. Designed for sustained defensive fire from prepared positions, the weapon required time to establish proper fields of fire and coordinate with supporting infantry. Yamamoto's first burst was accurate but brief, constrained by Japanese doctrine that emphasized ammunition conservation and precise target engagement. The return fire lasted less than 3 seconds before automatic fire from multiple Marine positions suppressed the machine gun crew. Private Kenji Tanaka, manning a rifle position 20 yards from Ogasawara's command post, attempted to engage individual Marines with his Arisaka, but found himself overwhelmed by the volume and intensity of automatic fire directed at his position. Each time he raised his rifle to aim, bullets would impact around his foxhole, spraying coral fragments and forcing him to take cover. The bolt-action mechanism of his rifle, which had served Japanese soldiers effectively in previous conflicts, became a liability when facing enemies who could maintain continuous automatic fire while advancing. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was as important as the physical damage inflicted by automatic fire. Soldiers who had been trained to expect predictable engagement patterns found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to violate fundamental assumptions about infantry combat. The constant noise, the inability to locate specific targets, and the relentless advance of forces that never seemed to seek cover created a form of sensory overload that Japanese training had not addressed. As the Marine assault reached its crescendo, the fundamental difference between Japanese defensive doctrine and American offensive tactics became undeniably clear. Japanese forces, organized and trained to defeat enemies who would seek cover and return aimed fire, were helpless against attackers who advanced while shooting automatically. The bar had not simply provided the Marines with superior firepower. It had enabled them to employ tactics that made traditional defensive thinking obsolete. The battle lasted 18 minutes from first contact to the moment when Japanese resistance collapsed entirely, but those 18 minutes fundamentally altered how both sides understood infantry warfare in the Pacific. Sergeant Isamu Ogasawara, bleeding from coral fragments that had been blasted from his defensive position, watched in stunned disbelief as Marines continued to advance through terrain that should have been impassable for attacking forces. The automatic fire that had seemed impossible to locate or suppress gradually resolved into individual weapons carried by soldiers who moved with tactical confidence that contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine assumed about infantry behavior under fire. The turning point came when Jackson flanked the Japanese machine gun position, while Basilone maintained suppressive fire from the front. Moving through a grove of banana trees that provided concealment from the Type 96's field of fire, Jackson approached to within 30 yards of the machine gun crew before opening fire with his bar. The 20-round burst caught Private Takeshi Yamamoto as he attempted to traverse his weapon toward the new threat, killing the machine gunner instantly and wounding his assistant. The psychological impact on surrounding Japanese positions was immediate and devastating. If their primary automatic weapon could be neutralized so quickly by a single Marine with a portable automatic rifle, what hope did individual riflemen have against an entire squad equipped with similar weapons? The collapse of organized Japanese resistance followed a pattern that would be repeated across dozens of Pacific battlefields over the next 3 years. Defensive positions that had been carefully coordinated to provide mutual support became isolated strongpoints as automatic fire prevented communication between foxholes and bunkers. Japanese soldiers, unable to coordinate their fire or maneuver to supporting positions, found themselves fighting individual battles against an enemy that maintained tactical cohesion through superior firepower and mobility. Within minutes, the defensive line that had taken weeks to construct was reduced to scattered pockets of resistance that could be eliminated systematically by Marines who advanced with the confidence that comes from overwhelming tactical superiority. Ogasawara managed to escape the destruction of his platoon by crawling through a drainage ditch that connected his position to a secondary defensive line 200 yards to the rear. As he withdrew, he could hear the distinctive sound of American automatic weapons growing closer, punctuated by the occasional crack of Japanese rifles that seemed pathetically inadequate against the mechanical thunder of multiple bars firing simultaneously. The sergeant had lost 14 of his 18 men in less than 20 minutes, casualties that would have been spread across hours or days of fighting if the Americans had employed conventional infantry tactics. The tactical lessons that emerged from this engagement were documented in Marine Corps after-action reports that would influence infantry doctrine for decades to come. The concentration of automatic weapons at the squad level had proven more effective than traditional fire support arrangements that relied on separate machine gun sections. Each bar-equipped squad could generate firepower equivalent to a full platoon armed with conventional rifles, while maintaining the mobility necessary for jungle warfare. This force multiplication effect allowed Marine units to achieve local superiority even when outnumbered by defending forces. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, reviewing casualty reports from defensive positions around Henderson Field, began to understand that American infantry tactics represented something fundamentally different from the conventional warfare his forces had been trained to counter. Japanese intelligence reports from November 1942 described American soldiers who advanced while firing continuously, never seeking cover, behavior that seemed to violate basic principles of infantry survival. These reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations from demoralized troops, but the pattern repeated itself across multiple engagements with consistent results. The psychological impact of the bar extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with American automatic weapons began to exhibit symptoms that military physicians recognized as combat fatigue, but which were actually responses to a form of warfare that contradicted their fundamental assumptions about how infantry combat functioned. The sound of American automatic fire became associated with inevitable defeat, creating a psychological conditioning that made Japanese defensive positions increasingly brittle as the war progressed. Jackson's experience during the engagement typified the transformation of American infantry tactics that the bar had enabled. Moving through the captured Japanese positions, he could see evidence of careful preparation that would have been devastatingly effective against conventional infantry attacks. The foxholes were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. The ammunition supplies were adequate for sustained combat, and the camouflage was expertly applied. But all of these advantages had been neutralized by automatic weapons that could suppress defensive positions while advancing, preventing the defenders from utilizing their carefully planned fire coordination. The captured Japanese equipment told the story of a military force that had been prepared to fight a different kind of war. Arisaka rifles with carefully maintained actions and precisely zeroed sights lay abandoned next to positions where their operators had been unable to fire more than a few rounds before being overwhelmed by automatic fire. The Type 96 machine gun position contained hundreds of rounds of unused ammunition, testimony to the crew's inability to engage effectively against attackers who maintained continuous suppressive fire while maneuvering. Basilone surveyed the battlefield with the professional satisfaction of a Marine who had seen his tactics vindicated by results. The bar in his hands had enabled him to accomplish what would have required a full company using conventional tactics, and the weapon's psychological effect had been as important as its physical destructiveness. The Japanese defenders had been defeated not just by superior firepower, but by tactics that had made their training and preparation irrelevant. The broader implications of this tactical revolution became apparent as Marine Corps units applied similar techniques across the Pacific Theater. At Bougainville in November 1943, Marine squads equipped with bars consistently overran Japanese positions that had been expected to require battalion-level attacks. At Peleliu in September 1944, automatic weapons enabled Marines to maintain offensive momentum against cave positions that conventional tactics would have required siege techniques to reduce. Each engagement demonstrated that portable automatic weapons had fundamentally altered the relationship between offense and defense in infantry warfare. The Japanese military's attempts to adapt to American tactics revealed the depth of the doctrinal challenge they faced. Captured documents from late 1944 showed that Japanese commanders had identified the BR as the key to American tactical success, but their proposed countermeasures reflected fundamental misunderstandings about how the weapon was employed. Japanese training bulletins recommended concentrating fire on American automatic riflemen, not recognizing that each Marine squad contained multiple bars and that suppressing one weapon would not prevent the others from maintaining fire superiority. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond World War II, influencing infantry tactics through Korea, Vietnam, and into the modern era. The principle that individual soldiers could carry weapons capable of squad-level firepower became the foundation of assault rifle development, leading to weapons like the AK-47 and M16 that embodied the lessons learned from the bar's tactical impact. The walking fire techniques that had terrorized Japanese defenders became standard infantry doctrine, taught to soldiers who never realized they were employing tactics developed in the jungles of Guadalcanal by Marines who had discovered that automatic weapons could rewrite the fundamental rules of infantry combat.